Hello everyone. Hope everybody is doing good. Well, today we're going to talk about a very interesting system. Do you know how you blame everything on hormones? Like when you have a pimple, when your mood's not right, or when you like a certain person, we always blame it on hormones, right? So today we're going to see the system that's actually responsible in producing the hormones. So we're going to talk about the endocrine system. So we'll be looking at all the different organs that make up the endocrine system, especially the anatomical aspects of the organs, as well as some of the hormones that they produce. So we're not going to talk so much about the actions of the hormone or what they do, because I'll leave that to the physiologist to do that for you. So what we're going to do is more on the anatomy of how these particular organs look like and where they are located in your body. In our body, we have two major controlling systems. One is the nervous system and the other is the endocrine system. Of course, the nervous system is the most superior one, but the second major controlling system that we have is actually the endocrine system, which helps coordinate and integrate a lot of our body cells activity along with the nervous system. So the nervous system is actually a very rapid kind of control system in which it works via nerve impulses and often produces a outcome or a reaction towards a certain stimuli within like milliseconds. However, the endocrine system is a bit more different because it works via hormones, and hormones are literally the chemical messengers that are secreted by the cells into the extracellular fluid. So it takes a little bit more time for it to actually exert a certain effect, because you need to synthesize the hormone and then release it, and then it has to bind, and then only then a certain effect is actually felt. So there's a bit of a difference in the way both this system works, but however, the endocrine system's effect is usually more prolonged. So once the hormones is already in the blood, it takes a long time for the effects to actually be worn out. Like, very good example, if in the case of a pregnancy, the hormonal influence is there for the whole 9 months of the pregnancy, so the effect is actually very long. As long as there's hormones in the blood, the effect will be actually felt. Okay, so it takes like from anywhere from seconds to days to hours or even weeks for the endocrine system's effect to be actually felt or to be produced, compared to the nervous system where everything is like very fast and very rapidly done. Hormones are literally what causes our endocrine system to function. Okay, so these are the chemical messengers that are secreted by one type of cell and exerts its effect on another type of cell. Okay, so for example, you have cells secreting the hormone, and when they release it into the blood vessels, these hormones will actually travel until they find what they know as their target cells. So target cells are literally cells that have these receptors, which are very specific to the type of hormone being released. Okay, so the action of your hormone is literally what we call as the lock and key kind of concept. I think you know this. So a particular type of hormone will literally fit into a particular type of receptor. So cells that actually project these receptors in them or on their cell surface are known as the target cells. So organs that actually contain target cells will be a target organ. Okay, so for example, if you have thyroid stimulating hormones being released by your pituitary gland, these particular hormones will only go and bind to your thyroid gland, because that is where their receptors are. It will not go and bind to your adrenal gland, or it won't go and bind to your stomach or any other place in your body, because it has to find the receptor where it has an effect on. So that's how hormones actually work. So when you look at hormones, we can chemically classify them, because these are chemical substances. Okay, so you either classify them as amino acid hormones or steroid hormones. So amino acid hormones are a more wider group of hormones that we actually have, and these hormones, they actually have their receptors on cell membranes. Most cells that are responding to amino acid based hormones will actually project their receptor to this hormone on their cell surface, where once the hormone binds to them, it will cause a secondary messenger and a secondary reaction to take place before the effect of the hormone is actually produced. Whereas the other group of hormone is known as the steroid hormones. So these are all your sex hormones. These are all come under the steroid hormone groups. Literally, you only have them from your gonads, which is your ovaries and testes, or you get them from your adrenal cortical. Okay, there's two places where you have steroid based hormones being produced. So for this type of hormone, their receptors are actually inside the cell. Okay, they are not projected outside the plasma membrane like for your amino acid hormone. So these are inside the cell, so the hormone literally goes inside the cell to bind to the receptor. Okay, so if you see how hormones actually work, they either work through a negative feedback mechanism or a positive feedback mechanism. This one is more on physiology, which will tell you like when there's too much of something, it counteracts the production of that particular hormone, or if there's too little, then it causes it to have more production. So that's the mechanism of how your hormones are actually being produced in your body. The endocrine organs are actually a very important group of organs because they control many things in our daily life, our body systems, reproduction, growth, development, the homeostasis are all literally under the control of your endocrine system. So they play a very important function in our body. So if you look at the organs that make up this system, you'll find that they're all scattered in various locations in your body. They are not grouped together like your GIT system or something where everything is nicely grouped and linked together. But endocrine organs are not like that. They are very small organs, but they are widely separated from each other, and every gland has its own separate function. And if you look at these organs, they are actually known to be ductless. Okay, ductless meaning they are totally in contrast with the exocrine glands, which actually has a nice defined ductal system in which their secretions are actually released. But endocrine organs don't have this ductal system. So to compensate on that, these organs are usually said to be very well vascularized glands. When you say something is very well vascularized, it literally means there's a lot of blood vessels, and this is important because they need to directly release their hormones into these blood vessels, and that's why these organs are usually very rich in blood vessel supplies. And if you actually look at their cell arrangement within the organs, you find that they are always arranged in these cords or branching like networks like this, and this is actually to maximize the contact of these cells with the surrounding blood vessels. These are all the major endocrine glands that we have in our body. So the main endocrine glands are the hypothalamus, the pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, and pineal gland. But out of these group of glands that I'm putting in the box here, these are known as purely endocrine gland. What I mean by purely endocrine gland is that their sole function is to just produce hormone. They don't do anything else in your body but only to produce hormone, compared to your organs with endocrine functions such as your gonad, your thymus, and your pancreas. These are actually organs that have other functions to do, but producing hormone is also part of their function. Okay, so they are not purely endocrine like those of your pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, and pineal gland. Okay, so there is a difference here. So when we talk about hypothalamus is literally the master control center. Okay, because it is a master control center because it even controls your pituitary gland, which is one of the most major endocrine gland that we have in our body. Okay, so the pituitary gland itself is under the control of the hypothalamus. That's why the hypothalamus gets the title as the master control center. So if you see the location of your hypothalamus, it's literally in the diencephalon. Okay, diencephalon is this section where there's this green and red color. your thalamus and hypothalamus are there. So if you want to describe the location of your hypothalamus, so we can say that it is above the brainstem. It forms the ventral part of your diencephalon. So ventral means below. So it's in this green region, that's your hypothalamus, and it's below the thalamus. Okay, so these are the 3 points that you can use to describe the location of your hypothalamus. So what your hypothalamus does, it's basically, one of its main function is in your autonomic nervous system, like controlling your body temperature, your hunger, thirst, and other stuffs. But beyond that, it also synthesizes and secretes what we know as neurohormones. Okay, so neurohormones are the ones that will control your pituitary function. So how the hypothalamus actually provides its highest level of endocrine function is via 3 mechanisms. Firstly, it secretes regulatory hormones to control the anterior lobe of your pituitary gland. Okay, so take note, it secretes hormones to control the anterior lobe of your pituitary gland. So this is your anterior lobe of your pituitary gland. So whatever hormones secreted by the hypothalamus will travel through the blood vessels to the cells in your anterior lobe, and of course the particular hormones will bind to the particular receptor, and the cells in your anterior lobe will then produce the hormones, which will then affect any of the other endocrine organs or glands. So that's the first function. It secretes hormone to control the anterior lobe of your pituitary gland. Secondly, it produces 2 hormones which we know as ADH, antidiuretic hormone, as well as oxytocin. So these 2 hormones are produced in the hypothalamus and sent down via the axons of the nerves to the posterior lobe of your pituitary gland, and it is stored there until when needed it is released into the surrounding blood vessels. So that's the second function of it. It produces 2 hormones. And thirdly, it controls the adrenal gland medulla via these nerve fibers, your motor fibers, to assist or to trigger the production or secretion of your epinephrine or norepinephrine. This is your adrenaline and noradrenaline, another name for these hormones that are solely responsible for your flight and fright reaction. Okay, so it's a direct control. That means it triggers directly your adrenal gland to secrete your epinephrine and norepinephrine. And from here you can see, because it has a direct control via the motor fibers, so the production of your epinephrine and norepinephrine is fairly rapid. Okay, you don't take too long for it to be produced, and this is important because these are the hormones that are involved in your flight fright response. So when you are confronted in a dangerous situation, you need to react, you need to run, or you need to do something. So you can't be waiting for your hormones to slowly be released to your blood, then go and find the receptor to bind, and then cause the gland to actually produce another hormone. That is just going to take way too long. So that is why this particular control system is directly innervated to the adrenal gland, so that the production is rapid and fast, so that our body can actually react in terms of emergency. The pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis. That's literally another name for your pituitary gland. So the term hypophysis is something that you will actually come across quite often whenever we talk about structures that are related to your pituitary gland. So they tend to use that term hypophysis. Okay, so when we talk about pituitary gland, you need to know that this is one of the most important or the major endocrine gland that we have in our body, and that is why it's known as the master gland, because you have almost about 9 different hormones being released by the gland collectively. And even though there's so many hormones coming out from it, it's actually a very small gland. It's a small oval shaped gland, almost in the size of a pea, that is hanging down from your hypothalamus. So that's why, because it's below the hypothalamus, we say it as inferior to the hypothalamus, but connected to the hypothalamus by the structure known as the infundibulum. And precisely where you'll find your pituitary gland is in the area known as the hypophyseal fossa, that's found in the sella turcica of a sphenoid bone. And from the term hypophyseal, you know this is actually referring to your hypophysis, which is the pituitary gland. And the term fossa is usually used when you refer to any depression that occurs within a bone, like a depression or a space within a bone. So we'll look exactly where this is in the subsequent slide. Okay, if you remember from your musculoskeletal lecture, you remember the sphenoid bone, this nice bat-shaped bone, the yellow one in the middle, like a butterfly shape, the sphenoid bone. Okay, if you look at it from the top, that means from the superior view, you remove your brain and you look down, you will see that it has this small depression here, this area. Okay, there, over there, that one where the arrow is pointing, so that area is known as sella turcica. Okay, sella turcica, that is sella turcica. So the deepest portion of the sella turcica over here, where it is highlighted in red, okay, that is known as the hypophyseal fossa, okay, of the sella turcica. That means that's the deepest depression in the sella turcica, and that is where your pituitary gland is actually sitting at. Okay, so if you want to access the pituitary gland in terms of when, if in case there's a pituitary tumor or something, usually surgeons will do it through the nose. Okay, they will access it through the nasal passage. That's the easiest way to actually access your pituitary gland. So when we look at our pituitary gland, you'll actually find it to be inferior to your hypothalamus, so over here. And it is actually literally divided into two different lobes, which is your anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so both these lobes are very different structurally and functionally, and the posterior pituitary gland is actually what is connecting the entire gland to the hypothalamus through the infundibulum. Okay, the anterior gland is not directly connected to the hypothalamus. It literally comes and merges with the posterior pituitary gland. So this merging occurs during the embryological development, and both this gland actually has different origin and different tissue composition. That's why they are structurally and functionally very different to each other. But collectively they release about 9 peptide hormones, 7 from your anterior and 2 from your posterior pituitary gland. So when we look at the two lobes, the anterior lobe is actually named the adenohypophysis. So you see the term hypophysis actually occurring here, and the word adeno actually means gland. So from the word adenohypophysis, you'll get an idea that this lobe is actually made out of glandular tissues, compared to the posterior lobe, which is known as the neurohypophysis. So the word neuro will give you an idea that this is actually made out of neuronal tissues. Okay, so the anterior lobe is totally glandular tissue and the posterior lobe is totally neuronal tissue. So the posterior lobe's content of tissue is similar to the hypothalamus. Okay, so this is because the anterior pituitary gland literally grew out from the outpocketing of your oral mucosa, while the posterior pituitary gland was an extension from the third ventricle of your brains. So the composition of your posterior pituitary gland tissue is mostly the nervous tissue, whereas the anterior gland has the glandular tissue kind of composition. And if you look at them in terms of histology, you can actually see the difference between both these glands. So pars distalis actually refers to your anterior pituitary gland, and the posterior pituitary gland is known as the pars nervosa. You can see the difference in their staining. The pars distalis is actually very intensely stained because they are glandular tissue and they pick up more stain compared to the nervous tissue, which are more lightly stained. And you can see the composition of your pars nervosa, which is your posterior pituitary gland, is almost similar to those of your hypothalamus. So here you can actually look at how both this anterior and posterior pituitary gland was actually formed, and you can actually realize why they actually have different composition of tissues in them. So basically what happened was your posterior pituitary gland actually grew from the neuroectoderm. The neuroectoderm is literally the germ layer that is going to give rise to all your nervous tissues, whereas the oropharynx ectoderm is the germ layer that gives rise to the structures of your oral cavity, your mouth and all that. So this is the layer that will actually give rise to your anterior pituitary gland. So there's totally two different types of germ layers here that are actually forming your pituitary gland. So from your neuroectoderm, the posterior pituitary gland will eventually grow downwards, whereas from your oropharynx ectoderms, there will be a projection called the rat case pouch. Okay, the rat case pouch will grow upwards, and eventually they will meet and fuse. So the neuroectoderm and this rat case pouch will eventually fuse at one point, and the connection with the lower oropharynx ectoderm is actually lost. Okay, so what happens is, what you get at the end is your pituitary gland with both the anterior and posterior lobe. So you can see a little bit of the remnant here between the fusion of both these two germ layers happen to form your glands, and that one you can actually see in your histological slide. So you remember this slide from the earlier slide that we saw. So the empty space here that you see is literally the remnant of the rat case pouch that was eventually growing out to fuse with the posterior part of the pituitary gland. So okay, so posterior pituitary gland, we already know it's known as the neurohypophysis. So from the word neurohypophysis, and you've already seen that the tissue composition is basically nervous tissue. So this is also known as the pars nervosa. So the posterior pituitary gland literally has three different terms that you can use to describe it: neurohypophysis, or pars nervosa, or posterior pituitary gland. So this is not a true endocrine gland. Okay, so why do we say it's not a true endocrine gland? Is because there's literally no hormones being produced by the posterior pituitary gland. It doesn't produce any hormones. What it does, it literally just stores hormones, and the two hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary gland is the ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and the oxytocin, which is literally produced by your hypothalamus. Okay, the cell bodies in the hypothalamus will produce both these hormones, which are packaged and sent down via the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. This is literally axons, collections of axon fibers that brings down the hormones and stores them in the vesicles in your posterior pituitary gland. So when there is a need for the hormones to be released, the posterior pituitary gland then releases them into the systemic blood circulation. Okay, so the two hormones that you should remember here is the ADH, which is literally involved in your water absorption. It has an effect at the renal tubule. And you have the oxytocin, which is a very powerful hormone that causes contraction of the uterus during childbirth, as well as during breastfeeding, lactation process. It has an effect during that as well. Okay, so together with the infundibulum, the posterior pituitary gland is actually known as the neurohypophysis. So you literally have to include the infundibulum in order to use that word neurohypophysis. In contrast, your anterior pituitary gland, known as the adenohypophysis, actually composed of three regions, which is the pars distalis, and then you have the pars intermedia and the pars tuberalis. Okay, so the pars distalis makes up the major bulk of your anterior pituitary gland, whereas separating the anterior and posterior pituitary gland is this intermediate region, which is known as the pars intermedia. And the pars tubularis is basically the part of the anterior pituitary gland that is actually coming and wrapping around this infundibulum and allowing it to be connected to the posterior pituitary gland as well. Okay, so the posterior pituitary gland, on the other hand, it is also known as pars nervosa because it's made out of nervous tissue, so they call it pars nervosa, and together with the infundibulous stalk is what makes up the posterior pituitary gland. Whereas over here, anterior pituitary gland has the three sections that we have just spoken about. So from the anterior pituitary gland, we have about 6 major hormones that are being secreted: the thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, prolactin. Whereas the 7th one, your melanocyte stimulating hormone, this is solely secreted by the region in the middle, the pars intermedia. So this is literally the only hormone that is actually being secreted by the pars intermedia, the melanocyte stimulating hormone. And from its name, you will know that its effect is on the melanocyte cells in your skin. Whereas out of the 6 hormones that are secreted by your anterior pituitary gland, the first 4, your thyroid, your ACTH, your follicle stimulating, and LH, are known as tropic hormones. So what we mean by tropic hormones are hormones that are released by your pituitary gland, but they will go and bind to another endocrine gland in order to produce more hormones. So they have a stimulating kind of effect. Like for example, your thyroid stimulating hormone will actually be released by your anterior pituitary gland and eventually bind to the receptors found in your thyroid gland in order to cause your thyroid gland to produce the thyroxine and triiodothyronine hormones that is needed for your body. So that's what happens with all the other 3 also. They have a stimulating effect towards another endocrine gland. So that's why they are known as tropic hormone. Compared to growth hormone and prolactin, they tend to have a more widespread kind of acceptance, where the receptors, wherever the receptors are found in your cells in your body, these hormones will actually have an effect on. So they don't go and bind to any particular endocrine gland in order to produce more hormones. Here we're actually looking at the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. So literally what this is, it's just a very special, unique blood microcirculation system that actually exists between the hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so these are literally just vessels in the brain that help connect both this hypothalamus with the anterior pituitary gland. And this is very special because only exists here in your anterior pituitary gland. And what we can see here is literally, your hypothalamus will actually regulate the hormonal output from your anterior pituitary. So this is done via secretion of releasing or inhibiting hormones that are produced in your hypothalamus. And these hormones will be then secreted into the capillary bed. This one, the first one, which we know as the primary capillary plexus. Okay, so the hormones synthesized by your hypothalamus will be released into the primary capillary bed first and taken down through these portal veins to the secondary capillary bed, which is the secondary plexus, which is actually found in your anterior pituitary gland. So the hormone synthesized from your hypothalamus then travels down here through the portal vein and is then released to the cells in your anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so from there the hormones then will either bind to the receptor and cause production of more hormones or inhibition of productions of hormone, which is then released into the blood circulation that goes into systemic blood circulation. Okay, so what we have here is actually 2 sets of capillary bed. One is up here nearer or closer to the hypothalamus, and the other one being on your anterior pituitary gland. Okay, and both connected through this portal vein system. Okay, so this is very unique. You only find it for your anterior pituitary gland. So this is what we call as the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, and it is important because one thing is it cuts short the travel time from your hormones that are released from your hypothalamus to reach the anterior pituitary gland, and secondly, it also prevents your hormones from getting lost or diluted. In case if it's released into the whole blood systemic circulation, it may take a longer time for it to actually reach the anterior pituitary gland. So this is one reason why it has a special set of connecting capillaries for the hormones to actually come and reach the anterior pituitary gland in a much faster rate. Okay, so contrast to your posterior pituitary gland, you can see that the posterior pituitary gland has its own capillary beds that is just found at the posterior gland, so there is no connecting capillary bed to the hypothalamus, and you don't really need this because if you remember, your posterior pituitary gland is not reacting to any hormone synthesis. They do not synthesize any hormones, so they don't really need such a connection. Okay, so they are just Okay, let's recap what we have done so far. So you've learned about the hypothalamus, and what you need to know from your hypothalamus is it has three major controlling mechanisms. One, it controls your anterior pituitary gland by either releasing, stimulating, or releasing hormone or inhibiting hormones, and it produces ADH and oxytocin, which are stored in your posterior pituitary gland, and it also has a direct stimulating effect through the sympathetic nervous system to your adrenal medulla in order to produce your epinephrine and your norepinephrine hormones. And as for your pituitary gland, remember that it is also known as your hypophysis, and you have two lobes, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, and they all have different names, also additional names. So anterior lobe is also known as your adenohypophysis, which has three parts, which is the pars distalis, pars intermedia, and pars tuberalis, and they secrete about 7 hormones, and these are made out of glandular tissues. And then you have your posterior lobe, also known as your neurohypophysis, consisting of your pars nervosa and the infundibulum, and these are mostly nervous tissues, and there is no hormone production over here, only storage of ADH and oxytocin. And the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system is a very special unique blood vessel system of microcirculation connecting your hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary gland. The thyroid gland is literally the largest purely endocrine gland that we have in our body. It has a unique butterfly shape because it has two lateral lobes that are connected by isthmus. Lateral lobes, lateral means side, so you have two lobes, and you find it at the anterior parts of your neck, so near the neck region, exactly on the trachea, and inferior, that means below the larynx. So this is the largest endocrine gland, and it is a very unique gland also because this is the only endocrine gland that literally can store hormones in large quantities. The other endocrine glands can't really store hormones, they just produce and release them, but your thyroid gland actually is unique because it is capable of storing these thyroid hormones that it is produced there. Okay, and the thyroid gland is also very rich in blood supplies because it has two major blood supplies, which is the superior and inferior thyroid arteries that are actually supplying blood to the gland, and the secretion of the hormones, of your thyroid hormones, is very highly dependent on the thyroid gland pituitary gland negative feedback process. So that's literally showing you the structure of your thyroid gland as well as its location just below the larynx, in front of the trachea, and at your anterior part of your neck. And you can see it's nice butterfly shaped, and this is the isthmus, the tissues that are connecting both the right lobe and the left lobe. So anterior view, this is what you will see, but posteriorly at the back, you'll find that it is embedded with these parathyroid glands. We will look into parathyroid glands in a short while. So this shows you image of the blood vessels that are involved in supplying blood to your thyroid gland. So literally the thyroid gland gets its supply from the superior thyroid artery that originates from the external carotid artery, and the inferior thyroid artery, which is originating from the subclavian arteries. So the thyroid gland actually has a lot of blood supply, making thyroid surgery a very difficult to perform task for surgeons because of the very rich vasculature of the thyroid gland. Okay, and for about 10% of the population, we have this additional thyroid artery known as thyroidema artery. Okay, this one is not in everybody, only about 10% of the population has this branch of artery supplying blood to the thyroid gland. And as for the venous drainage, the thyroid gland is actually drained by the superior thyroid vein and middle thyroid vein that drains into the internal jugular vein, as well as the inferior thyroid vein that drains into the left brachiocephalic veins. Okay, so these are all just the vasculators involved in supplying blood to you. Let's look at it in a microscopic way. So if you look at it under the microscope or histological section of your thyroid gland, you will see that it has a lot of follicles, all these round structures that you're seeing, like they look like small tiny balls all clumped up together to actually form your thyroid gland. So these numerous follicles are spear shaped, and every single follicle actually has a single layer of cuboidal cells. Okay, these are the epithelial cells. They are cuboidal cells that make up the surrounding epithelium of your follicle. So these are actually known as the follicular cells, and these are the cells that are actually responsible in synthesizing or producing glycoprotein thyroglobulin that actually later on attaches to iodine and forms the thyroid hormones, and eventually is stored in this area in the middle, which we call as the colloids. Okay, it's a sticky amber colored material that actually stores your thyroid hormones. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the thyroid gland is very unique because it can store its hormone. So this is where it actually stores it, in the colloid. So whenever the body needs it, or whenever the thyroid stimulating hormone from your pituitary gland comes and binds to the receptors on your follicular cell, so it triggers the release of this hormone immediately into your blood vessel, and at the same time it also triggers the synthesis of more thyroid hormone to restock the hormones that has just been released from your thyroid gland. Okay, so they are actually stored in the colloid. And another interesting thing that you will see if you look at the thyroid gland is between the follicular cells you have what we know as these very lightly staining parafollicular cells. These are a totally different group of cell, and they have totally different function because they are literally involved in the calcium calcium homeostasis. Okay, so they produce this hormone called calcitonin that participates in maintaining the calcium balance in your body. As for the thyroid hormone themselves, you have two of it, which is the T3 and T4, thyroxine and triiodothyronine, which are literally the body's major metabolic hormones. Okay, your thyroid hormone is one of the major hormones in our body, and every cell in your body actually responds to your thyroid hormones. So this is a very important organ that actually, when it's not working properly, the effect is actually quite obvious. You will see the disease being manifested in a very obvious condition. So we've seen the thyroid gland. So if you look at the back of your thyroid gland, that means in a posterior view of your thyroid gland, you will find 4 tiny yellow brown glands, which is your parathyroid gland. So their location is literally hidden from the view. They are only found posterior to your thyroid gland. So we have actually 4 of them, but there are cases that people have found almost 8 in certain individuals, but many people in general only have 4. And this particular gland produces what we know as a very important hormone for the calcium balance in our blood. Okay, this is the parathyroid hormone, or PTH, produced by chief cells. Okay, so your parathyroid hormone literally has two different type of cells. One is the chief cell and the other is the oxyphil cell. So the chief cell's primary function is production of parathyroid hormone that controls the calcium balance in the blood. As for oxyphil cells, the function is not really known till today. So that's the location of your parathyroid gland, the four tiny glands at the back of your or posterior to your thyroid gland. Okay, so if you look at them, the parathyroid cells that secrete the parathyroid hormone actually makes up the larger population of cells in the parathyroid gland. Moving on, we will talk about the adrenal gland. Okay, so the adrenal gland is also known as the suprarenal gland, and the name is very easy to relate to because when you say ad, that means it's near. So renal means kidney, so adrenal means it's near kidney. But if you say it's suprarenal, supra means above, so renal means kidney, so it's above kidney. So its name literally means either it's near the kidney or it's above the kidney. So literally the location of your adrenal gland is above the kidney. Okay, it sits atop the kidney, right on top of the kidney, and you have two of it. So you have a pair of adrenal gland. It's almost pyramidal shape, especially the right adrenal gland. The left one is a bit more of a crescent kind of shape. Okay, the right one is more of a pyramid shape. Okay, and these are organs that we say that are retroperitoneally located. Okay, when you say organs that are retroperitoneal, that means they are behind your peritoneal cavity. Okay, so you find them behind your peritoneal cavity, and it's usually embedded in a nice layer of fat and a fibrous capsule that actually nicely protects and minimizes their movement. Yeah? So there's literally no connection with the kidneys. They just sit on top of the kidney, but they are not in any way connected to the kidney. Yeah? So if we look at the adrenal gland, if you cut it into half, what you'll find is a central medulla, and you'll find a cortex surrounding it, and this whole thing is nicely kept in a capsule. Okay, so you have the outer capsule, this adrenal cortex, and the adrenal medulla that makes up the structure of your adrenal gland. So if we look at the adrenal cortex, you will see that this particular area is very yellowish in color because it's very high in lipid or fat storage. So that's why it gives a very yellowish color to the gland, the structure of this adrenal cortex. But it's a very important area of your adrenal gland because almost more than 25 types of steroid-based hormones are actually synthesized by your adrenal cortex, and collectively they call this whole group of hormones as corticosteroids, and they work under the stimulation of the ACTH hormone that is produced by your anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so if you look at the adrenal cortex in a more detailed manner, that you will find that it's actually arranged in three layers or three zones, which is the zona glomerulosa. Okay, so this is like a circular kind of arrangement. It looks more like your glomerulus of your kidney, the renal tubules. When we do the urinary system, you'll actually see the structure of a glomerulus. So that is exactly how these zona glomerulosa cells are arranged like. And true enough, they produce mineralocorticoids. Okay, so mineralocorticoids, especially what we know as aldosterone, which is a hormone that actually helps control mineral and water balance through the renin-angiotensin mechanism, which actually has a primary effect at the kidney. So when you do urinary system, you'll actually learn more about this. Okay, so that's one way to relate the glomerulosa with the glomerulus of the kidney and the function of the hormone, which is at the kidney itself. Okay, so the second layer is what we know as zona fasciculata. Here the cells are actually arranged in a fascicle kind of arrangement, and they produce one of the important hormones in our body, which is in a group of glucocorticoids. Okay, so glucocorticoids are known as metabolic hormones, and it's precisely here we know it as the cortisol, which is very important because cortisol literally affects the way how our body utilizes your glucose in the body. And finally, the third layer, which is the zona reticularis. Okay, so this is a net-like arrangement. This is a much smaller layer compared to the other two, and what it produces a small amount of gonadocorticoids, which is literally your sex hormones. Okay, so the role of your gonadocorticoids, or the small amount of hormones that are produced by these zona reticularis, it's still very unclear why these hormones are actually produced from here. But it was noted that, at the age of 7 to 13 years old, you will find a rise of production of these gonadocorticoids from your adrenal cortex. Probably this is also the time where there's an onset of puberty, so probably they help during puberty onset. Okay, so that's the three layers of your adrenal cortex, and they produce very important hormones in our body. So if we look into the adrenal medulla, so the adrenal medulla has totally a different kind of structure and function compared to the cortex earlier. So the inner medulla is more like a knot-like nervous tissue, because this is the part that is connected to the sympathetic nervous system. So if you remember your hypothalamus function, the one of the function was to directly connect to the adrenal medulla in order to produce the epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, so this is because it's part of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, there's a direct innervation from your hypothalamus to your adrenal medulla. So what you'll find in your adrenal medulla is literally nervous tissues. Okay, so this is the inner core of the medulla, which is usually reddish in color and highly vascularized too. And it has what we know as the spherical cells known as chromaffin cells, which are literally responsible for the secretion of your epinephrine and norepinephrine, or what we know as adrenaline and noradrenaline, which highly participates in your flight, fight, response, or emergency response. So this is basically showing you the different zones and structure of your adrenal gland. So just to recap, it has a capsule in the middle, then it has the cortex, the outer layer, and an inner medulla. Okay, so the cortex is made out of three zones: the glomerulosa, fasciculata, and the reticularis, each producing different kind of hormones. The glomerulosa produces aldosterone, fasciculata produces cortisols, and reticularis produces your androgens, or what we know as your gonadotropics. Okay, and in the adrenal medulla, you have production of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Moving on, we will talk about the pineal gland. This is a very tiny pine cone shaped gland that's literally found hanging at the back here on the roof of the third ventricle in the diencephalon. Tiny as it might be, but it's also a very important and interesting gland. So in your pineal gland, what you'll find is a lot of these secretory cells known as pinealocytes. And pinealocytes' major secretory product is literally the melatonin. If you know, the melatonin is a hormone that we call as sleep hormone. Okay, so its prime function is basically to regulate your circadian rhythm. If you know what's a circadian rhythm, it's basically your sleep-wake cycle of your body. So when you have melatonin, it actually helps make sure that you actually sleep during the night and you are awake during the day. So because it is a sleep hormone, it usually rises during the night when it becomes dark. When there's reduction in light coming into your eyes, then the pineal gland starts to secrete more of your melatonin, and that's why you become more drowsy and sleepy at night. Okay, so if you have bright lights at night, you actually disturb the production of this melatonin and suppress the sleep cycle. Okay, and besides that, melatonin also is known to have another role, which is the suppression of the gonadotropin production, and this actually is what it does is it controls the onset of puberty. So it makes sure the gonadotropin production is suppressed, so there's not much sex hormones being produced. So this is true for young children, so that they do not attend puberty in a very early stage, because the melatonin actually helps suppress the production of this gonadotropin and controls the onset of the puberty itself. Okay, so as you age, as you grow older, you will see that there are lots of these calcium salts, okay, being deposited between the pinealocytes, so you can see all these black color structures here. These are all calcium salt that are being deposited in the pineal gland between the pinealocyte. So that's why as you grow older, people who age, like your grandmothers or grandfathers, usually their main complaint is, they can't sleep at night. And you know why? Because as you grow older, the gland is actually being deposited with more calcium salts, so the production of your melatonin also is reducing, so your sleep cycle is eventually disrupted. So that's why older people always complain that they can't sleep. Finally, we will look at the organs that have endocrine function. That means these are organs that have other function, but part of their function is also to produce hormones. So we will not go too in detail on these organs, because each of these organs are actually discussed further when you do the respective topics. Like when you talk about gonads, your ovaries and testes, their main production is your sex hormones, and we talk about them when we do the reproductive system. And then you have your thymus. Okay, thymus is literally involved in the development of T lymphocytes, so they are hormones that they are produced more for maturation of the T lymphocytes. You talk about the thymus when we do the lymphatic system. And finally, pancreas. Pancreas is an interesting gland because it has both the endocrine and exocrine function, and we will talk more about the pancreas when you do your GIT system. But just for a brief intro, we just look at the thymus and the pancreas. So the thymus is actually a bilobe structure. Okay, so it's situated here in the mediastinum, that means in the middle of your thoracic cavity there. It's just superior to the heart, that means it is on top of the heart, and it's behind your sternum, posterior to your sternum. And it has thymic epithelial cells that actually secretes hormones such as thymulin, thymopoietin, and thymosin, and all of these are actually involved in the development of your T lymphocyte. Okay, so thymus is usually large. This gland is actually large when you are young, as a young child, but as you grow and reach adulthood, it gradually shrinks, and eventually by the time you reach old age or adulthood, it's just a remnant or a scar-like tissue that is left there. And pancreas, as I told you, pancreas is a mixed gland. It has both endocrine and exocrine function. And because we are talking about the endocrine function, so we will look more of its endocrine function. Where you find your location of your pancreas is it's between your duodenum of your small intestine and the spleen, and it's posterior to the stomach. So don't worry so much about this, because you will actually learn more about this in your GIT system. So that's your pancreas over there. Looks like a leafy kind of structure. So it just lies behind your stomach, posterior to your stomach. And if you look at the cell, as you know, it has both the exocrine and the endocrine function. The exocrine function is mainly by these pancreatic acinine cells, which produces the pancreatic juices that are carried to the small intestine, which involve in more of your digestion process. Well, scattered among these acinines, you'll find these small groups of structures that we know as islets of Langerhans. Okay, so if you look at the pancreas itself, you will find scattered among these acinines at selected areas are these islets of Langerhans, which has a few types of cells. that are involved in synthesizing hormones that is involved in your glucose metabolism, like your insulin and your glucagons actually produced and synthesized by these islets of Langerhans. So that is literally the endocrine function of your pancreas.